Now, you guys have already done some booking in, I know, so already a bit familiar. I've got quite a number of points, so hopefully I won't forget anything.
Sure.
Now, one of the most important things when the when the samples come in, is to read the paperwork, because the paperwork might tell you actually quite a lot, and it might also introduce some variations into what we usually do. So it's always good to read the paperwork at some point, preferably before booking in, but at some point. For instance, that one you looked at yesterday, if we just unwrap the parcel, it was a cow, and we'd think, oh, it's an MFM count. But it wasn't, it was an ID. But that information was on the paperwork. It was put in a bit of a peculiar way, I've got to admit, not as clear as it's been in the past, but you can just ask somebody, but it was there, that they didn't want a fibre count, they wanted something else. Yet they wanted like an identification, like a bulk material. So that's why we look at the paperwork, because we think it was a fibre count, but it isn't.
So they were looking for crystalline silica on a cow.
No, they were looking for a asbestos ID.
Oh, right. So this
on a filter,
right.
Dust on a filter in a cow. Right. So it actually became a dust ID.
Yeah. Oh, that's the one we looked at yesterday.
Yeah, that's the one you did yesterday. Now, for instance, another thing that happens with North Parkes mines, they put information and then they say, would you please refill the cassettes in this instance? Now, that's something, again, I need to check each time the paperwork comes in, because on the very odd occasion they've said they do not want the cassettes refilled. But when North Parkes mines comes in, they almost always want their dust cassettes refilled and sent back out again. Another thing which has come up recently, and I also missed, is we pretty well presume that every RD that comes in, every respirable dust, like you guys are weighing, is going to be put for quartz. But it just might be that it's not. And that came up with Chris Abbey and Boral recently. It was on the paperwork that he only wanted respirable dust. So again, we look at the paperwork and the analysis and any other information. It's okay if you think something is unusual with the paperwork to contact the client and query it. I mean, in that case, unless Chris had drawn it to my attention, I might actually have queried him and said, oh, are you sure, do you want RQ? Okay. Now, the first column is the date received, and that's the date received by the lab or any personnel. So if we're out in the field, like you've taken samples home with your mum, or Gary's brought them in the next day, it's actually the date they were in our personnel's hands. So it would have been the day before, even though Gary gives us the samples for booking in the next day, they would go the day of sampling. So it's the date they actually come into the lab's hands. Same as if somebody leaves something in the box overnight. Actually, it's in the box, but it hasn't actually come into our hands. So in that case, it would be the following day, even though we're pretty sure it was in the box the night before, but it hasn't actually come into our hands.
So is it sort of safe to say that as soon as we touch it, it's the day that we...
Yeah, that's actually a really good way of putting it. The minute one of us sort of touches it and takes it in.
And I'm not incorrect. You might get another link Pulse Services where you put them together in one batch and you'll put the date in which you enter it in.
Thank you for drawing my attention to that, which isn't in my notes. Richard is absolutely correct and picked me up on it. That is the one exception that we do for Coal Services. We use the date they are actually booked in and the kiln put on. I do often, when I'm holding them over, I actually write the date received on there, so I keep it. But the interesting thing is with the certificate, with this one exception, usually the certificate reads date received. On Coal Services Ashed, the certificate reads period ending, because they are under the understanding that we have accumulated them. So yeah, that's the one exception where we where we would touch them, but it not be the date. Thanks, Richard. Okay, so that date received actually goes across the board and it ties everything together in the system, because all the certificates and the spreadsheets use that same date in reverse in their file name, and that's also a good way of keeping everything together in the system and tying things together, particularly if we're looking back at things that have been done earlier. And moving on to, which you'll probably do too, the reports. The reports are dated, the site visit as well, even though the person might actually be doing the report a month later, the file name on the report will still be the date they were out in the field.
Okay.
Okay, so that's the date tying together. Now, if possible, we need to fill in all the columns in the book. The first column is the date. The second column is the client. That can be a little weird because sometimes more than one person is involved, but just do your best or ask. Mostly it's straightforward, but sometimes it does get a bit strange. Third column is for a purchase order, a job number or a contact. Purchase order and job numbers are the most important, but we're not going to have them for all jobs anyway, so just a contact after that if we don't have the other two. The next column is the sample number. With filters, I noticed we've got the cassettes and the filters. That's good. The most important thing is actually the filter numbers, but we also need those cassette numbers. That's our other information. So the sample number goes first, and then a short description as you've been doing. In the case of them not being a great variety, just a filter as received or a sample as received, if all we know, just to cover all of it is fine. But as with that one, just a little bit more info. You don't have to write everything that goes on the sample sheet, because sometimes that can be too long-winded. It's just something to differentiate it is fine, but that's good.
All right.
Okay. The next is the date sample, and it's probably, as you know, if we don't know, it's NS for not specified, and that goes across the board on the sheets, on the certificates. It'll all be, not specified to show we don't know. The next column is the test required, whatever the test required is, and then the timesheet number. Now,
So the timesheet number is only circled once the invoice is raised?
That was way down there. That's I'm the only person that circles it. Yeah, that's a message to me.
What if I bring a sample in and I've got the money with me?
You would still wait for me to circle it, because in that case you've got the money.
I've been doing it wrong.
But we haven't done the invoice. It's actually when it's in the invoicing system.
Got it.
To show that
I should just leave
client.
that.
Yeah, if you don't mind. Back to the paperwork. A purchase order is important. So if there's a purchase order, for instance, Tamworth Labs that send us IDs, there will be a purchase order on all their paperwork. It generally begins with a P. And so if there's a job number or a purchase order number, that goes under client ref there, and it's quite important. With some people, it's going to be a job number, like we had Mattis the other day, and they had a 5-digit job number there. But again, it gets confusing because not everybody's going to do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Again, RCA that you looked at yesterday, they had a job number on their paperwork, and there is a difference between a purchase
So if they have
order
it there,
number
we
and a
just
job number.
we fill it in there. But
Yeah.
if not, we put in the contact name, right?
Yeah, well, the contact name can actually go there, but you can leave that blank if there's absolutely nothing.
Oh, all right.
Yeah, but the contact can go. And I slip up and forget to put POs down too, but that's where it goes. But it's important I find it if it's there. Right. Is with dust and quartz now. I see. Was it Ali? Was it you that booked in? Yes. Good. What you've done is, because I'd set them out in the trays, you probably noticed that Sharon's paperwork was in kind of filter order. you can consult with your mum, but on the whole, even if the client lists their samples out of order, we book them in filter order because that's how they were pre-weighed. And if we start, it's going to make it a bit of a rod for our back. So even if they've got them out of order, which Sharon frequently does, and Chris Aby of Boral does, he often has it in basic order, but then goes a little bit. We still try and book them in filter order to make it easier for ourselves with the spreadsheets. Otherwise, too much has changing around, and then there's the more potential for things to go wrong. Now, something that hasn't been happening all the time is actually, all the paperwork should also be cross-referenced with the lab numbers. So, for instance, Sharon's there is now going to become 94742 to 73, and that's important. Where you probably haven't seen the filing upstairs, where all the lab paperwork is filed. It's in a box, and it starts with the lowest number first and goes up, always the lowest to the highest. And it is important that the paperwork from the clients be cross-referenced, because if it gets out of order or we need to refer to it quickly, we need to be able to find it. So any client's paperwork, for instance, like like Tamworth Labs, that sheet they have with their information, that gets kept, and it should also have the lab numbers on it in the corner for filing later. Now, this wasn't a good one to choose. Really, also on the paperwork, we should be able to see which was which lab number. Now, you know all about that with Coal Services, that you put the stickers on the paperwork, yeah. And I mean, in that case, I wouldn't be writing it in the corner because it's clear as day. Mm-hmm. It's very easily found. Usually, also with multiple samples, if they're not in exact order, they should have the lab numbers indicated. Now, I'm going to fight with that one because it is a bit, there's not a lot of room there. So even what I might do is do, a 1 and then through, showing it goes through, but I'll sort that out. That we should be able, for the checking purposes, be able to quickly check the filter numbers against the lab numbers on the certificate. So Katrina, if she was checking this, would, if I didn't sort of draw her attention to it, would presume that maybe that was the second one, which it's not, because we went by number order, so it's that one. So I'll sort that out. That's something that can happen too. Yes, also, as you can see too, I've listed the filter numbers against the cassette numbers. That's also something that needs to happen. It all needs to be tied together so we can see what's happening, and so the checker can see what's happening, because the checker won't have the lab book necessarily either, which has that cross. It needs to be on the paperwork. Again, if there's any questions, where we would go to would be the filed paperwork. So that's where it needs to be. Now, I just made a note about Sam Sims, and I've called it Oops. Her paperwork is often written on plastic bags, and she's the only one that does this. But the thing is that we can quickly open the plastic bag and put it in the bin, and her sample numbers are on the plastic bag or written on the tape of the cyclone. So we have to be a bit careful when Sam Sims comes in, that we sort of think, don't think, there's no paperwork. Have a look at the samplers and the bags. Mm-hmm. It's a bit of a pain in, and we have spoken to her about it, but she still does it. All right, I've got the note. Now, we don't get a lot of these, but we get clients asking for bulk quartz and respirable fraction. So if a quartz sample comes in and you're not sure what's happening, just ask. I think you've both looked at the bulk quartz respirable fractions. You know, for instance, that they're not filtered straight away there. bags of stuff.
Yeah.
The one caution is that sometimes clients don't entirely know what they want, and their description of the analysis on the paperwork might be confusing. And you'll look at it and think, well, do they want bulk quartz, or do they want respirable fraction? And we may actually even have to get in contact with them and find out from them, because their wording might be confusing, and in fact they mightn't be too clear what they want. That's been known to happen too. I know. Noel. Just a caution with bulk quartz and respirable fraction. Right, you know about filling in the timesheets and to circle the priority if it's a priority. I heard you asking about MFMs this morning, that they are a priority, but we don't need to circle that because it's a given. Yeah, but we need to do that for IDs and even occasionally quartz. Quartz needs. We had some ACOM ashed quartz before Christmas that was priority. Yeah. So I do look for those.
So with MFMs, we don't circle yes or no. We don't circle the yes part. We just circle no.
No, because all MFMs are a priority anyway.
Oh, all right.
Yeah, they're an automatic priority.
Okay.
And the thing about circling that is we charge people a surcharge for rushing it through and putting our other clients aside. But it's understood that MFMs are important, and that's included in the.
Oh, I see.
That's part of the charge, that they. It's a priority analysis.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And that's the difference. That's purely for invoicing purposes. Right. Oh, and the last point I've got here is that with blanks, that also can get a little confusing. The only blanks we book into the system are for the MFMs. Now, on the odd occasion, a client won't include a blank, and in that case, we will add one out of our own stock. Hopefully similar, like if they have our MFMs, which people do, we would use one from the same set. However, if it's a totally weird set like Fiji, but they include blanks anyway, we probably wouldn't, because they're totally different. But if it's particularly a set of ours and they've just got so busy they've had to use all the samples they've got and not had one left over for a blank, we would go and get another blank and book it in. And we will book a blank in all cases. But as you know, like with the dust, although we weigh the dust blanks, they are not booked in. If Chris Abbey or now, did you book in the book? Yeah, no, you wouldn't have. With the field blanks here, for instance, for Sharon, they wouldn't have been.
Yeah, booked in, because I did ask my mum.
Oh, good.
This morning,
Yeah,
she did
yes,
say-
blanks for dust are not booked in. And as happened to Melville the other day too, when a client sends a blank for quartz, we will analyse it as a pre and post, but again, we won't book it in.
Okay.
So often blanks will be used in the analysis and not booked in and not charged for. But MFM blanks, yes, they are booked in and they're charged for. The only thing is with field blanks, they do get a half charge, but don't worry about that. That's the pre-weigh. It's not the fact that they're blank. It's we've supplied them a weighed filter. So
Are you going to explain the number of blanks that you're required to have?
well, that's not really booking in.
So if
This
you
was
get
a booking in toolbox.
so if you get a series of MFMs from someone and they've done it over a number of days.
Oh no, that's a good point, Richard. Yes.
Or there's more than a certain number of samples taken on the same day, would you require or investigate the number of blanks?
Probably we may still be inclined to analyse them all with one blank over several days, particularly if it's all going on one certificate. You're talking about the MFMs. Yeah, I like with the roads and maritime services, they would tend to assign a blank a day anyway, and we would analyse that. If somebody sent us a whole pile and we were analysing them together, we might just add one. But it is in general one per day, Richard's.
Well, then you,
And
then
if you get, which I've never ever seen, if you get more than 20, you would need to double your.
Well, MFMs.
Is that I have? That's not one I've heard. But see, in the case of Fiji, we do get over 20, but then they send multiple blanks anyway.
Yes, per day.
Yeah, there would be. I've been sending something like up to 4 blanks. Yeah. So that's probably it.
So with the blanks, it's just for MFMs we put those in.
Yeah.
For,
Only-
for other things we don't.
Other things you don't book in the blanks.
Okay.
Because they won't actually be reported on a certificate. You know, when you report the quartz and the dust, you just report the amount of dust and the amount of quartz on the FDIR. You don't actually report the blank. Whereas, as you both have got getting experience, you physically count the blanks
Yep.
on the MFMs and it is reported. So
Okay.
that's probably the difference. And don't worry, a whole lot of our clients struggle with this too.
I'm curious, on a blank that is to do with the RDIQ, which is taken into account, the whole purpose of having a blank is whether or not you've actually contaminated.
You would have to see Katrina about that one. Yeah.
Why we wouldn't analyse it, you have to tell them whether or not they've got a potentially background level that succeeds.
I know.
The blanks we're using are the ones
Like
that
the
are
lab
our own
blanks.
trace.
No, well, that's you'd have to see Katrina about that. I'm not sure that I'm entirely, yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay,
Thanks.
good. And if I've forgotten anything, but hopefully that's okay. All of it.
So you're going to save that on and
Mhm.
use it in paper?